Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. I am Ruben Abati.
I am Oji Akpe. On Tuesday, the International Monetary Fund, in its World Economic Outlook, which was unveiled at the ongoing IMF World Bank meetings taking place in Bali, Indonesia, warned Nigeria and other sub-Saharan African countries to check their rising debt stocks, diversify their economies, or face crisis. This came on the back of yet another request by President Muhammadu Buhari, seeking the National Assembly's approval for a fresh $2.86 billion external loan. If the National Assembly approves the presidential request, it will raise Nigeria's external debt stock, currently put at $22.31 billion, to $24.94 billion. Meanwhile, about two-thirds of the government revenue goes into servicing just interest payments of these foreign loans, with the principal amount still waiting for redemption at maturity. As Nigeria's debt to foreign creditors continues to spiral, especially under the extant administration, many are beginning to question the rationale for the borrowings and what it portends for the future generations of this country after it has extricated itself from the huge debt overhang and threatened to strangulate Nigeria just 12 years ago. Here to discuss to us on Nigeria's ballooning foreign debt and what it means for our country is the Managing Director and Chief Executive of Cowry Asset Management, Mr. Johnson Chukwu. Good morning. Welcome to the morning show.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Johnson. Good to see you.
Good to see you again.
Now, let's go straight to business. What do you make of the IMF advice? I mean, typically, the Nigerian government will say, or whether it's IMF or the World Bank or the HSBC Securities or the Economic Intelligence Unit of the Economies or Financial Times, that, look, these people are not making sense. What do you make of this latest advice coming from the IMF?
Well, let me start from what we all know. I mean, conventional wisdom is that if you reject advice, you are obviously looking for it you are obviously going to destroy yourself. It is not wise for the government or anybody to only accept praise and reject negative feedback. IMF, World Bank, Economic Intelligence Unit, Financial Times, they have no negative, they have no ulterior motive in advising Nigeria to manage our finances appropriately. And if you look at the issue of debt, today, you did mention in your introduction that our total local currency is about $22.3 billion. Cast your mind back to December 2004, when Nigeria's total national foreign currency was on $36 billion. At that point, we were struggling to meet our debt payment obligations. We had to go to the Paris Club to have them write off $18 billion of our national debt, and we paid $12 billion to reduce our national debt to a marginal...
That was under the Obasanjo administration.
That act was actually consummated on 29th of June 2005. Today, we have ratcheted up a total foreign currency of $22.3 billion. Our total national debt today is actually higher than what it was in 2004, because our total national debt in 2004 was only $46 billion. Today, we're dealing with a total national debt of $43 billion. And our economy has not expanded as much as one would have expected. Our total current GDP in dollar terms is only $367 billion. So our total debt today is about 19.4 billion, 4% of our total national debt. But it's not just in share as it relates to the share of GDP. What is most critical is our capacity to pay back the debt and meet our interest payment obligation. I'll be made allusion to the fact that today we're using 67% of total revenue to service debt. And we're going to be accumulating that debt. And unfortunately, I'm not sure anybody can point to the fact that this debt is going into infrastructure.
But I raised the question with Obeze Kusili earlier on, that the government says, look, this is sustainable, this is under control, and that in terms of debt to GDP ratio, we are even under borrowing. We are not borrowing enough. So you find a situation whereby we are saying, as ordinary people, as Nigerians, and you as an expert, that is not sustainable. I mean, why this contradiction between the experts and government?
Well, like you rightly said, the government has a duty to defend their policies. It is left for us as Nigerians, you and I, and every other person, to change the narrative, to refocus the government attention to where they are getting it wrong. There's actually nothing wrong with borrowing, and I must always say this. But the reality is that when you borrow, and you are borrowing for consumption, you are obviously digging a hole. because you are not building the capacity to fund the repayment of that loan.
Exactly.
The challenge we have had so far is not just that the government is borrowing, it is that it's largely borrowing for consumption. And I'll give you a classical example. The government has borrowed between 10 and 11 trillion over the past 3.5 years. Total capital expenditure in 2016 was only 1.5 trillion. The budget for 2017 was 2.36 trillion, but only 1.5 trillion was disbursed. Even if you assume the entire capital budget in 2016 was disbursed, which was not the case, because the implementation of that budget was far below par, you would be having that the government has spent about 3 trillion in capital expenditure. They just announced that they were released about 460 billion. So if you add that, you are dealing with about 3.46 trillion expenditure in capital for capital purposes. But total borrowing has ballooned by about 11 trillion. So where did the rest of the money go to? Basically, we are consuming it. Where government is spending the borrowing on overhead. Okay. And that's where the challenge is.
Okay, so what type of debt management strategy should Nigeria adopt to ensure that Nigeria's debt is sustainable and also yielding positive results? What type of strategy?
Okay, you know the debt management strategy is just a subset of the fiscal policy of the government. We should first have what is the overall fiscal objective of the government. The issue of debt should be when we want to fund the fiscal plan. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. So what's our fiscal plan? How do we want to grow the economy? And when you define that, you are also define what are the sectors that should be a priority. And basically, when we define, because we talk about the medium-term expenditure framework and the annual budget, and it looks like the documents that we prepare just to fulfill our righteousness. Because if we have a fiscal plan, then we'll now say, okay, this is going to be the national deficit, the budgetary deficit, and then how do we fund the deficit? When you look at what will be the effect of funding the deficit by borrowing, and what will be the cost of this borrowing, and how do we fund this interest cost and repayment plan, then you can actually step back and say, look, do we really need to build infrastructure with budgetary allocation, or do we need to change our strategy for infrastructure development and bring in private capital to build it? And that's very critical, because a situation where we keep ballooning government borrowing on the basis that is ad hoc, because what we're dealing with is ad hoc economic management. And step back, look at the Minister of Budget's presentation of the 2018 budget. He said the 2017 budget, there was a total government budgetary revenue of 5.08 trillion naira. The government only received 2.7 trillion naira, leaving a gap of 2.3 trillion naira. So compelling the government to borrow. So if that is the case, do we have what you call an alternative plan and say, look, if our revenue is not meeting up to budget, must we borrow entirely? Because it simply means all 2017, all the capital expenditure we incurred, we are borrowed. Okay. So that means that process of funding infrastructure is not sustainable, and we need to rethink how we fund infrastructure. Well, and that we define the debt plan.
One of the excuses that government gives is that it's been able to build a very healthy external reserve, and that, you know, we shouldn't worry about debts because we have a very healthy balance in our foreign reserve. Well, of how much value is that?
Okay, you know, for you to understand the foreign reserve, you need to decompose it. You need to break it into different components.
Okay, break it down for us.
One, when you talk of the $43.7 billion we have today, this government has, last year, or in fact, February this year, we borrowed $2.5 billion from the Eurobond. It is part of your foreign reserve today. In November 2017, we borrowed $3 billion. It is part of what you have in the reserve. Overall, we have about outstanding foreign currency Eurobond debt of about $8.3 billion. It's part of your reserve. Take it out of your reserve, because eventually you have to pay it back. It is your money. Yeah. And then take out the swaps, the exchanges between the Naira component that central bank takes from banks and give them dollars. What of the future sales of dollars in the foreign exchange market? By the time you decompose and then you take out the foreign portfolio investment balances in our foreign reserve, you are going to end up with a reserve that is not more than $20 billion.
What is
So
the
the
state of
figure
our
they are
foreign
quoting
reserve right
is
now?
not true.
That's what they call gross reserve. We need to look at the net reserve. Take out your obligations to third parties, and then you determine what you have. I'm not saying the $20 billion is too low for this side of the economy, because what matters, the benchmark is that you look at 3 months of import bill. Of course, certainly we will have a net reserve that can cover up to 7 months of import bill. But we have to recognize that our foreign exchange earnings source is not stable. Our major foreign exchange earnings source is sale of crude. Today we're seeing a crude price of $80. It might not be sustainable in the long run. But most importantly, the technology is changing. And if you have been to Europe recently, you realize that fossil fuel will no longer be a major source of energy in the foreseeable future. So if we continue to rely on crude sales, because crude prices doing about $80, and we believe our foreign exchange is sustainable, that is fallacious.
Well, one of the pieces of advice given by IMF is the diversification of revenue by these affected countries. But if you look at another excuse that this government gives, they say they met a totally empty treasury, and that on account of that, they have to borrow. But the question other people raise is that what of the other sources of revenue from stamp duties, from oil? Oil has gone up now.
Yes,
from FIRS, on which they've been very aggressive, tax collection, right? So do you think that that excuse is valid?
You know, I think without being political, leadership is allowed.
No, you can be political. Why not?
Well, I'm not schooled in political issues, but leadership is all about transformation. It's all about taking people from where they were to a new destination. That's what leadership is all about. So if we met an empty treasury, at which point crude price was trading about $35 per barrel. I mean, crude price dropped about $35 per barrel. So we had to borrow to fund capital expenditure, fund government expenditure. Today, crude is trading at about $80. The key thing is at what rate is the economy growing? And if we cast our mind back to 2010, because I have done an analysis of the GDP growth rate from 2010 to 2018. In 2010, our GDP grew about 5.4%. The lowest we grew between 2010 and 2014 was about 4% GDP. At the point when the crude price was trading at current level in the past 18 years, our least GDP growth rate was in the neighborhood of 8%. So if I want to challenge the government, and I'll ask them, you are earning the best we could get from oil. Our GDP is still growing at 1.5%. So it's simply something is missing in terms of economic management. And we need to challenge the government for that. Because why am I challenging the government that? It is in our collective interest, an enlightened self-interest of all of us, that we push the government to do the right things. Because if the government is failing in its duties, we are all struggle to manage our personal and business lives. But back to your question, the diversification that we're talking of, should it not be helpful? Should it not begin to manifest that? I must give them credit in terms of tax revenue management.
Tax revenue management. Okay.
The government is actually doing very well in growing our tax revenue.
Okay.
And that's
what do you make of the new bill that President Buhari
the executive bill?
The executive bill. What do you make of that?
Well, what I think is that it's in tandem with what's happening all over the world. Today, the U.S. has a bill, a law, that talks about global income for U.S. citizens. In England, they are also implementing something close to that.
Correct.
But the key thing is that the government must also sign what we call double taxation agreement with countries that Nigerians are generally living.
Aren't they doing that with Switzerland right now? Right?
Yes.
Yeah, correct.
So we must sign double taxation agreement so that income do not suffer double taxes, both in the local environment economy where they earn their income and in our domestic economy where the income earner resides.
Correct, yes.
We need to make sure we avoid that.
But what does the law, what does the extant law in Nigeria, what does it say?
The extant law recognizes...
So that you don't use executive orders, as a legislative instrument, contrary to what the law itself says.
Okay, the law says, the current Federal Inland Revenue tax law says that a Nigerian will be taxed on your global income. Okay? That global income is silent whether it is made locally or made outside the country.
Sure.
And that is why some of the tax allowances are now applied after they've brought in all your global income, total income. But the reality is that they are talking of taxing your assets. An asset is not taxable. What is taxable is revenue. Okay, so if I have a property in US, for instance, or Switzerland or France, what they should tax the rental income I make from that property and not the value of that asset. Asset only comes into taxation when you are talking of capital gain.
Yes,
in that case, there is a change in ownership of an asset, and there's a profit made from that transfer of ownership.
Okay, real quick before we end, what do you make of the Africa-China relationship? Last month, the president went to China. I mean, the Chinese Exim Bank loaned us about 328 million on telecom infrastructure. What do you make of that?
Well, the key thing is that the loans coming from China, not just to Nigeria, to other African countries, must be managed effectively. A situation where some of those loans are granted for, not for specific projects, but in the case of Nigeria, when you talk of loan to the telecommunication sector, we need to ask ourselves, what is the government's role in telecommunication sector today? The telecommunication sector has been fully privatized. Okay. And unless we're going to build another national satellite, launch another national satellite, okay. But do we really need to launch a satellite today when we have private satellites by some of the telcos? So if we're borrowing for telecommunication, I do not think that's the most appropriate way to take a foreign currency obligation that has a long-term repayment responsibility on future citizens and put in a sector that is fully in the hands of the private sector.
Let's look at domestic debts. I mean, maybe we can see that on the screen. Okay. Many of our states, are so indebted, and this has implications for their capacity to fund their capital expenditure or even recurrent expenditure. Many of them cannot pay salaries. What can we do, to check some of these subnational units of the Federation from just, ramping up debts? Because this is not just about the federal government.
Well, we have to solve it from a fundamental or foundational issue. And that fundamental issue is, do we have fiscal autonomy at the state level? Do we have fiscal federalism? If we have fiscal federalism, I've advocated that, look, let's allow the states that cannot pay. Let's make provision in our constitution for states that are not physically viable to merge with the contiguous state that is fiscally viable with them. If we continue like that, there's something about what former governor of P2B normally said at one of these forums, I think that was May last year. At,
is it TEDx?
No, the platform. The platform.
The platform.
He said, and I quote Governor P2B, he said that you cannot have a drunkard when he's still busy in the bar, in the beer parlor drinking, and you come and clear his debt. He will continue his binge. I may not have used exactly the same words he used, but the reality...
the message is clear.
The reality is that you cannot continue to grant some budgetary support to state government that are not fiscally viable, and the state governors continue to balloon their recurrent expenditure. Right. If they find themselves in a situation where they cannot pay, they have several alternatives. At that point, they can go to the state citizen and ask for a referendum and say, look, my state is Abia State, for instance. I am not economically viable. Let's merge with Anambra or Imo State.
But
so you have viable
these foreign loans to these individuals.
No, he's talking about domestic debt.
Yeah, domestic debt. So you can have viable states. The next level is this. We need to have legislative autonomy. Because situations where a state governor calls a bank MD and demands for 2 billion naira loan, an obligation on the state, and the State Assembly is now aware, or is a lackey of the governor and cannot do anything about it, is part of the reasons why you are seeing state debt balloon. Because the truth is that most of the state debts are not structured. If the state government have to go to the bond market, local bond market to borrow, there are limitations, there are constraining factors that will make sure that they have the capacity to pay back. Because they have to measure their ability to pay back. And you cannot borrow more than 50% of your 12 months preceding 12 months revenue net of your debt obligations. So that will measure your capacity to pay back. But because those limiting factors constrain them from borrowing at will, they go to the money market. That is, they go to the banks, cut the friendship of the back MDs and borrow and impose obligation on the state assembly should be the bulwark to prevent such borrowing.
Well,
but unfortunately, they are very weak.
Now, the president has gone to the National Assembly. He's asking for approval to borrow more money, over 10 billion. What will you be saying to the lawmakers? How should they handle this latest request, which they have referred, of course, to the Appropriation Committee?
I think they have to look at it from a case-to-case basis, a case-by-case basis. We have to look at, are they purposes that are compelling, that are in the overall interest of the nation?
Well, they want to fund budget 2018 budget deficit.
Yes, and which is why I say, look, the government also have a duty to review the budget. We are 10 months into the fiscal year, and we have to look at what kind of revenue have we gone in meeting our revenue projections. And then because I come from a private sector background, if you prepare your budget, which we prepare annually as companies, and your revenue is not meeting up, your projected revenue is not meeting up to the plan, actual revenue is not meeting up projected revenue, you are not going to continue to incur some of the costs that you have projected. So the government has to be run like a business. And we need to define what is inevitable, what is indispensable, and what is dispensable, what is discretionary. The government must define what are the discretionary expenses that is currently carrying. There are some costs that the government need not carry. And because the reality, like I mentioned to you, in 2017, we saw a situation where the government revenue was marginally above 50% of the projected revenue. And we had to borrow the rest to cover just overhead, not to talk capital expenditure. If we continue that way, then we'll be back to the issue of what's a sustainable debt. Because the federal government, fortunately for us, the federal government has a lot of latitude to borrow. The federal government local currency borrowing, which is done through the Debt Management Office, is not under, they don't need to go to the National Assembly to ask the Debt Management Office to issue federal government bond or treasury bills.
But what they're asking for now, it's in two categories. There is an 8.8, and then there is a 2.6 billion, right? Okay. Is there a proper justification for this request? Because you say it should be on a case-by-case basis. And I match the two to say this is a total that they are looking for.
When I said case-by-case basis,
yes.
The government sent a supplementary budget to the National Assembly and said the government reallocates resources to INEC. That, for me, is not a feasible demand at this point in time. So there might be need to borrow for the purpose of funding the election. I mean, there's no sensible Nigerian will say, in that case, that we shouldn't borrow or provide funding to INEC. So in that case, our hands are tied, even if we have overborrowed. Because it's in the overall interest of the country that we conduct a free and fair election. That's one. Two, the foreign currency component, which they mentioned about $789 billion. They said it's to fund capital budgets. The question which the National Assembly should answer that the government has touted repeatedly that all borrowing will be tied to projects. Let's ask which components of the capital expenditure budget do we want to fund with the $2.8 billion? And let's tie it to the budget. If you go to the local currency debt to borrow from the bond market, I mean at the state level, you are required to tie to what we call utilization. You have to submit your utilization, which we say, look, this money we're borrowing will be tied to these projects. And the Security and Exchange Commission will monitor to ensure that those projects are implemented. We need to force that level of accountability at the federal level.
Thank you very much, Johnson Chukwu. It's been quite a delight having you on the morning show. Thank you very much.
I wish I had more time
always
with you.
Supporting
I have a few more questions for you, but I'll ask you after we go. Just checking. It's time now for a short break on the morning show. When we return, Arise News analyst Emmanuel Ifeni will join us to review some of the top stories on today's newspapers. Do stay with us.